So I'm here with Butch Lazorchak. He is from the Library of Congress. He's a digital archivist for National Digital Information Infrastructure and Preservation. So that's a program that you have over at the Library of Congress.
Yes.
It's great to have you on the Digital Music Trends coverage of South by Southwest 2013. It's actually the first interview of the festival, so thanks a lot for coming on.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So super interested in the preservation of audio. For me, it's been something that I've been interested in for a long time. I worked at the archives of Universal Music for almost 3 years. I know a little bit of that, and
the dark secrets.
Yeah, the dark secrets. Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about the Library of Congress, how audio preservation, how the program started. I think it probably has its roots in the early 2000s. So how did that come about, and how did that program start?
Great. Well, I'll talk. So there's a couple things. So the Library of Congress actually has one of the largest music collections in the world, probably the largest music collection in the world, in terms of the quantity and the quality of things. And so the part of the library that I work in is the digital preservation part. And what we really do is work with a network of partners outside the library to explore ways to preserve digital information of all different kinds, and music is certainly one of those kinds. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but within the library we have a campus, part of the library, which is out in Culpeper, Virginia. It's called the Packard campus, and that is where we've moved all the music collections and movie collections of the library out there. And it's a former Federal Reserve Bank building. Yeah. Which has been rehabilitated, been rehabbed to be a sort of state-of-the-art audio preservation, film preservation archive. Wow. And so there's climate-controlled things, and that's where all the music collections are at now. And that's a different part of the library that I work in, but it's definitely something worth checking out if you're interested in the actual collections that we have at the library.
Sure, of course. And you work specifically in reaching out to potential partners outside of the library in order to encourage preservation and encourage partnerships with the library to preserve the assets. So, and how did that program start out, and how did you start the conversations with potential partners to go about this?
Well, back in 2000, Congress of the United States was concerned that digital information was being created, but there was no plan for how this information, would be preserved over the long term. And the issues with digital information are that the technology changes so rapidly that if things aren't managed in a very coordinated way, this information can rapidly become not understandable anymore. Yeah. And so Congress recognized this as a huge interest and called on the library to explore this back in 2000. So we had a good bit of funding to do that. And because the library collects very widely in terms of the types of material it collects and its interests, yeah. We were tasked to collect across a broad range of digital content. And one of those types of content was digital audio. And a couple years, probably I think about 2004 or so, maybe 2006, started a project which is called Preserving Creative America. And these were specific projects that we were funded with partners in a variety of what we call creative sectors, to look at so that they would look at their particular types of digital information, and we'd do some research there and make some recommendations. So there's photography, there was public television content, and there was a project working with a company in Nashville called BMS Chase, who their business is that they do archiving for music, so analog archiving, but also digital archiving. And the work with them mainly dealt with interacting with recording studios, yeah. And how can there be tools that would enable recording studios to document all of the information that they were creating as part of the recording process in a standardized way that then could be shared across any services that came afterwards.
Of course.
And will include and preservation information would be a big part of that, because one of the issues is that different studios use different recording software, and each of those particular pieces of software has their own proprietary setup, and there's no way, even if you were able to get something out of those different tools, there's no guarantee that that's going to be understandable in future versions of the tool or understandable by other proprietary tools. And so this particular database was designed to collect the information, at least the metadata, the descriptive information about the recordings, in a way that could be standardized across different recording studios, different methodologies, and then shareable in some centralized way.
Yeah.
And so, actually, are you familiar with? I believe it's digital music. I'm trying to the NARM's digital music. The part of NARM that's digital music. I think it's called digitalmusic.com or digitalmusic.org. Yeah,
that's right.
They are actually looking at creating a workflow that builds on some of the work that BMS Chase did with their tool to create a model workflow that could be replicated across different possible workflows. So what's the metadata look like in the recording session? What happens to that metadata as it then gets consumed by different digital music services? And then at some point there's the archiving piece of it. How can they develop sort of, there won't be one archive, there'll be multiple archives, and maybe each label has their own archive or there's other centralized archives. But what happens there at the end of that workflow in terms of the archiving?
Yeah, of course. And, a big piece, reading the paper that was published recently, sorry, I forgot the name of it, just...
Yes, and I actually have a copy in my bag there.
Sorry, the name was? For
the National Recording Preservation Plan?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Sorry. And one of the sentences that really struck me, in the first few pages was the fact that, of course, we're all talking about preservation, and that's really important, especially on the audio front, because we know that there's such a nightmare in terms of formats and everything that needs to be taken into account. But also, of course, any effort of archival and preservation of the audio has to be done with the long view of actually making that material accessible in some form to the public. And of course, with music, that's always problematic because of issues of very long copyrights that prevent that from being particularly straightforward. So how do you guys deal with that part of it, and how is the audio accessible, after it's archived?
Right. Well, that is certainly one of the challenges that we have at the library, in that we are quite hesitant to make materials available that aren't copyright free, but we also have a very long view of things. So, we're collecting today for some user 100 years in the future, and the material we're collecting right now that's under copyright, at some point it'll be out of copyright, and we can make those materials accessible.
Yeah.
So the challenge for us making it accessible is that, so for example, we have we created a jukebox in working with MCA, I believe it's MCA Records, that makes a lot of their early 20th century materials available as part of a jukebox on the library's website. But all of that, that material is all out of copyright.
Yeah.
So you're not going to see contemporary materials being made accessible on the web in the way that maybe users would like. But we're continuing to bring in analog materials that come in as part of the copyright registration process.
Yeah.
And we're more and more starting to explore ways to bring in exclusively born digital type of content into the library.
Yeah.
And so I don't know all the things that are happening out at the Packard campus in regards to that, but I do know that, for example, they've got efforts underway with broadcast television, where they've got machines set up out there that are actually capturing the broadcast television in digital form as it's being broadcast.
Wow, great.
And so we're creating a huge archive of digitized television. And again, I don't know exactly what those guys are thinking out there in terms of what they want to collect, but certainly in the digital preservation side, we're aware of all these activities that are happening with digital music, and the different services where musicians are making their music available. And we do have a concern that those services will not be around for the long term, and if we don't do some sort of method of capture. Now, while they're active, we may not have the chance to capture them in the future. And so one concept that we have in the libraries and archives community is the concept of a dark archive. So, and there are a lot of issues there, because a lot of times we don't want to capture something unless we actually can make it accessible, right? But in some instances, there are materials that we feel are so extraordinarily important that even though we don't, and I'm not speaking about the Library of Congress particularly, but I'm saying the library and archives community, generally speaking, that these materials are so valuable. Someone needs to capture these now and worry about the accessibility part of it later.
Of course. And just to talk about labels, of course, the panel you have next week here at South by is with together with 3 record labels talking about their archiving issues. And so, how are you finding the conversations with them? Are there very desperate ways in which the labels are choosing to archive their audio or not choosing to archive it?
Right. Well, so. I spent probably a year looking for different labels who were interested in, who I felt were doing archiving to some degree or another.
Yeah.
And it was challenging. And in conversations with different labels, I find that many are not doing archiving. They're not necessarily archiving their analog materials, and they're definitely not archiving their digital materials. So a big part of doing a panel here at South by Southwest is trying to raise awareness amongst artists and labels of the need to do this. If they don't do it themselves, finding other people that they can work with to do this.
Sure.
So, for example, on the panel, Merge Records is on there. They're one of the biggest independent labels in the U.S. But they've partnered with, and they're located in Durham, North Carolina, but they've partnered with an organization at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, called the Southern Folklife Collection. And I don't know exactly what they're doing, and that'll come out in the conversation on Wednesday. Sure. But they're smart people who I think saved a lot of their materials from the very earliest days of their existence, and they've recognized to one degree or another that while they were good about collecting and saving, they're not necessarily in the long-term preservation business.
Sure.
And an organization like the Southern Folklife Collection is in the long-term preservation business. And so, to some degree, they've partnered with them to give them the materials that they had the foresight to collect themselves and save. And so I'm, these kind of partnerships are another way that libraries, archives, and museums can work with independent labels to ensure that the material survives after its business value has been sort of realized by the labels. Third Man Records, Jack White's record label, is also going to be on the panel, and they've built a thing in the Third Man offices called the Vault, which is a climate-controlled space that they've put all their master tapes in.
Yeah.
And so, to my understanding, Jack White has recognized, one, that there's a lot of value in the ownership of his own master recordings for monetization purposes. But there seems to be something deeper than that. This recognition that these materials, in addition to having monetary value, have cultural value, and that it's important for them to be proper stewards of these things. And then the third label is the Numero Group. Based out of Chicago, and Ken Shipley, one of the directors of Numero Group, is going to be on the panel, and they are a reissue label who does a tremendous job in doing artisanal reissues of hopelessly obscure and potentially completely lost music. So what they mainly do is the extraordinary measures of finding old analog tapes and rehabilitating them to the point and finding the artists and the recordings, rehabilitating them and then reissuing them while fully recognizing the ownership rights and copyrights of the original creators, and so doing them a fair shake.
Yeah.
But they do a very good job. But in the process of doing that, they're also creating digital artifacts of their own.
Of course.
Because when they create a CD, they've created a digital master. When they scan images to use as part of their packaging, they've created digital images there. So then they have a digital preservation problem moving forward, both again for their own, the ability for them to continue to monetize no matter what digital services appear, but then again, the investment that's been made into the they recognize the value of the original materials. They've made this investment in them and created this new artifact, and for cultural purposes alone, there's value in preserving that as well. Yeah. So I'm hoping we tease out a lot of those things from them in the conversation on Wednesday. I think it'll be really interesting.
That's great. Well, it was absolutely a pleasure having you on the show, and
it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.